Hi, just a quick warning before we start. This video will contain spoilers for the first half of Dragons Rising Season 4 and the seasons that preceded it. This is your final warning. Enjoy the video. Dragons Rising Season 3 is a season that I have an interesting relationship with, to say the least. I started off a hype cycle absolutely dreading it because of stuff regarding some of the arcs we knew going in, and then I ended up really liking the season after a significant chunk of parts who leaked a week after the first half. But once the season wrapped up in about end of August, I felt pretty conflicted and lost on how to actually feel about the whole thing. It's a very strange Ninjago installment in the sense that it kind of struggles to pay off a lot of what Season 2 set up while also setting up its own somewhat messy threads. But I think my ultimate conclusion that I drew is that I needed to see what Season 4 did with its setup and stories to really judge and see where they were going with all this. So now that we finally have the first half of Season 4 over half a year later, I should be able to actually cast judgment on how these storylines were handled. And I'll be honest, I'm pleasantly surprised by what's here despite my initial apprehension towards the season. There are some carryover issues from Season 3, along with some new issues, but on the whole this was a solid as hell Ninjago installment, and it feels like Dragons Rising has put itself back on track after a really messy third season. The highlight of the part for me was absolutely Lloyd's Master of Life arc. Not only is it just a really strong Lloyd story in isolation, but it does a wonderful job of tying all of his story threads in Dragons Rising together to create one of this show's best character stories to date, really nailing the idea that Dragons Rising is ultimately a show about connection and unity, a thread they've been hammering in since day one. I didn't really grow up with the earliest seasons of Ninjago like a lot of others did, so I wasn't expecting this storyline to leave as much of an impression on me as it did, but boy am I glad that it has, because they got me to care about the title of the Green Ninja in a way that I never really have in the past. Another wonderfully handled character was Zane, which I cannot believe I am saying. I've gone on record many times to call Zane's character unsalvageable and a train wreck, but for the first time in a very, very long time, Zane felt like himself again. And I've truly never been happier to have been wrong about a character before. I do think that some of his material is a little bit on the nose and handed to the viewer on a titanium platter, but I'm gonna be honest, I really don't care. It's just so peak. Then getting a moment about the importance of art and expressing oneself through that medium is a brilliant way to use the robot character in an age where AI is unfortunately running rampant. I am so happy that the writers seem to have taken the criticism on board for Zane's character, and I hope they can keep this up in the next few Dragons Rising parts, but for now, they should be really proud of what they've achieved with him. Good job, Ninjago. As for the new ninja, I think some of them got some really solid material for the most part. Wildfire and Frack in particular were highlights and a lot of fun, with their respective stories being really solid. Frack's story in particular hit some really good notes that felt grounded and realistic for his character to take, and his story doesn't shy away from being a bit more mature with the language used surrounding the relationship with his father, which is great. Wildfire doesn't exactly have that sort of story for this season, but she's just really funny and absolutely the MVP of her team. But after getting sidelined like she did for last season, this was a good return to form. Her taking on a leadership role after Egot's passing was really nice to see, and I honestly don't have any particular issues with how she's written here. It's the first time since the training arc that a character hasn't been overwritten by a male one, so they're making really good progress with her, I think. There are still some issues here and there with sidelining, since none of the newbies get the Draconis suits and they even acknowledge this within the story, but it's still a huge improvement over Season 3, so hopefully we're on an upwards trajectory for the new ninja, minus one who we'll get into now, because there are unfortunately some major disappointments among the ninja team, those being Jay and Aaron. The fact that I'd consider these two to be the weakest parts of the season so far is incredibly unfortunate because they were both highlights of the last season. So seeing them be the worst part here is a pretty big blow. Jay's story this season is particularly rough, but I won't spend too much time on it since I actually think I hit the nail on the head in the season's pre-release phase, but his memories being brought back by episode 4 is a real letdown, and on a fundamental level, backtracks on all of the meaningful development he'd had in Dragons Rising thus far. Aaron's story and character unfortunately is not much better. A big issue that I had with his character in Season 3 is that his time with Raz becomes almost irrelevant and dumbed down once he rejoins the ninja because of the parents being alive, and that issue seems to be carried over here. Granted, it does give us some really solid story beats for Lloyd, but Aaron's story being reduced down to a mere beat in Lloyd's is massively unfortunate. I was really hoping that we'd get to see Lloyd and Aaron slowly continue to rebuild their relationship, but this has kind of confirmed that they just wanted to get Aaron back with a ninja and restore the status quo as quickly as possible for the final leg of the show. At least that's the impression I get personally. His dynamic with Euphrasia is pretty weak too, especially since they're absolutely building to some sort of romance with them, which I have so much to say about, but this really isn't the place to do so, because this is just a part review. I am, unfortunately, very let down by both of these guys, and I hope they can do better in part 2, but I'm pretty doubtful since they've sent the ship for their character arc sailing at this point, and I don't think we're going to see those continued. As for the villains this part, like the Loyalists and the Elemental Monsters, I think they were pretty serviceable and pretty decent after Forbidden 5. I don't have a ton to say on them since the Elemental Monsters are just bad guys to punch, and the Imperium side of things didn't leave much of an impression on me, but I thought they were pretty good nonetheless. I simply don't have a lot to say on them, which, considering how much I had to say about the Forbidden 5 and Thunderfang, is probably a good thing. They served their purpose within the story and did fine. There's not much else to add to those guys, but there is a villain this part who's noticeably absent. Raz. Raz gets a whole 2 lines over these 10 episodes, and is only physically present to deliver one of them at the very end. While there's an argument to be made that it's a good thing we skipped over this arc to avoid further fetch quests, I think this feeds into a much larger issue with Raz that's become very noticeable since the Casket of Bones incident, which is that so much of what he does is off-screen. Once Aaron leaves, they can't be bothered to do any more than check in on Raz, so what we get of him is just aura farming and updating his master on where he's at in the plan. Raz hasn't been a substantial villain in over 16 episodes now, which is ludicrous. And while I expect great things from him in part 2, it sucks that we're not seeing the journey he's taking to get there. I really hope they can balance it out with substantial Raz content in part 2, but right now seeing our main villain get no substantial content is a bit disheartening. As for the actual story of this part, it's pretty weird, but I honestly think that it was a necessary step for the show to take to find its footing again after season 3. It's much more scaled back and lower stakes compared to last season, and in some areas it does work really well, and in others not so much. At this point of the story, we seem to be gearing up to the endgame of the show, with Raz slowly but surely gathering all the icons he needs to fulfill his master's goal. So I'm expecting to see more of that stuff in the latter half of the season, which is where they seem to relegate the main meat of the story to in Dragons Rising. While Imperium returning in Dragons Rising Season 4 is certainly a questionable move, because realistically we should have been done with these guys long ago, I think their inclusion works fine enough to get the story to where it needs to be for Raz to do his thing, so I'm pretty okay with their presence in this part so long as we actually get to see Raz cook in the next chapter, even if Imperium really should have been wrapped up 2 seasons ago at this point. Lloyd's material this season though, while good, is a bit more egregiously placed, because realistically this stuff should have been relegated to Season 3 Part 2, even if it's great here. In Season 3 Part 2, we had a fully trained Elemental Master of Decay to force Lloyd to develop his element of life so that he could fight her. We're focusing on the first realm, one of great importance to Lloyd's heritage, and neither Jay nor Aaron would have been back with a ninja yet. Instead of tying the Whispering Woods and the Elemental Master of Decay stuff together, Lloyd spends a great amount of Season 3 meandering and just not getting much character work, essentially just stalling until we can get to Season 4 where he gets this rich exploration of his power and character, while the actual second part of Season 3 has the ninja spend their time in the Land of Lee for a great amount of its runtime. Don't get me wrong, I like the Land of Lee plot, but wouldn't it have made so much more sense to put Lloyd's frantic scramble to unlock his elemental power and save the world in the season focusing on the 5 genocidal warlords, one of which has a direct contrast to his elements, and then plays the Land of Lee into the comparatively lower stakes of Season 4 Part 1? This next point is somewhat related and ties back to what I was saying earlier, but Aaron absolutely should have stayed with Raz longer. While I love the enemy Lloyd sequence, a lot of his verbal attacks fall a bit flat. He criticizes Lloyd for Aaron running off with Raz and Jay's state, but neither of these things really matter at this point. Aaron's firmly a ninja again and Jay's memories are back, both nonsensically rushed to an ending before this sequence. It would hit so much harder if these were real problems that Lloyd was still dealing with, but he's just not at this point in the story. It's a great sequence nonetheless for Lloyd's character and it has some great stuff in there, but it's very misplaced within the plot and comes a bit late when put next to everything surrounding it. What I'm really trying to get at is that this part, while it is good, does feel like it's trying to get the last of its necessary setup that they haven't done yet ready for the final third of the story, regardless of whether it actually makes sense in a purely plot sense. This feels like more of a conclusion to Act 2 of Dragons Rising than the start of Act 3 like many were expecting, myself included. Beyond some issues with the placement of these plotlines within the overarching story of Dragons Rising, I think it was pretty solid though. Scaling things back and having something that feels a bit more self-contained to get us to a point in the story where we can start the third act is a really good move after Season 3, and this part feels very reminiscent of early Dragons Rising, even if that is because we probably should have done some of this stuff sooner. I firmly enjoyed this season part when it really got going, and I am pretty damn excited to see where they take things in the second half. This was a really neat follow-up to Season 3 and handles the actual plot lines in some really fun and interesting ways, so I am pretty damn happy with what we got here. As for how this impacts my take on Season 3, I don't know. Again, we seem to be just now entering into the third act, so I think the quote-unquote epic conclusion will influence how I judge what came before, but even then, my thoughts on this part aren't quite conclusive. We still have half of the season left, so what I can say is subject to change in the coming months, so there isn't a lot I can say about this part that I feel won't be influenced when the latter half releases sometime in fall if it doesn't leak next week. With that said though, I think that's about everything I have to say right now on this part of Dragons Rising. I haven't gone too in depth here because I don't want to cram every thought I have into just one video, but if there is a specific topic you guys want to see me cover, feel free to let me know somewhere. If you guys want to discuss the newly released season with other fans, you can join my Discord server here or in the description. With all of that said though, have a lovely rest of your weekends and I will see you all soon. Goodbye for now. Really the worst part of Raz's absence is that I now owe Gino an entire life arc dragon. Don't gamble, kids.
Zeus, your son has returned. I bring the destruction of Olympus!